The noble pursuit of happiness. What the Buddha actually taught. Prince Siddhartha grew up in a household where the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of pleasure, was given free rein. As Buddha, he didn't talk much about his youth, but what he did mention were the pleasures he had, and that he decided that the pursuit of those pleasures was something ignoble. So he left them. He went out and ended up going to the other extreme, deciding that since the pursuit of pleasure was something not noble, he'd pursue pain. But he ultimately realized that that wasn't noble either. It just ground the mind down. He realized he would have died and gained nothing from it. So he cast around for other alternatives, and he finally landed on right concentration, which later became one of the factors of the path he taught. It was the first of the factors he discovered. He thought of the time when, as a young child, he'd spontaneously entered the first jhana. The question arose in his mind, could this be the path to awakening? And something inside said, yes. So why was he afraid of that pleasure? He'd been fleeing pleasure for 6 years at that point. So why was he afraid of that pleasure? He stopped to realize there was nothing blameworthy about it at all. It harmed no one, didn't intoxicate the mind, so he finally realized that this was a noble pleasure. And so he pursued it. He found that it was one of 8 factors for the path that were needed for awakening, and it was a necessary part of the path. There's another passage where he said that the other 7 factors of the path are the requisites for right concentration or noble right concentration, and the pleasure that comes from that concentration lies at the center of the path. So he realized the pursuit of pleasure in and of itself was not necessarily bad. It was just a matter of how you went about it and the kind of pleasure you were looking for. This is something we have to keep in mind, because it's so easy living in the world now to think of our practice of meditation as being something small-minded and selfish when so many people are suffering. But you have to stop and think, what's harmful about the way we pursue this pleasure? We're learning how to look after ourselves. We're learning how to be responsible in looking for happiness, looking for well-being. There's nothing in the Buddha's teachings that says that you have to make yourself suffer for the sake of other people's well-being. After all, what does that do? It makes your search for pleasure go underground. In the meantime, you start wondering, if their pleasure is so important, why isn't mine? Ideally, the Buddha said you work for the well-being of yourself and the well-being others. But you first have to start here, because if you don't know how to find true well-being, how are you going to help others? As the Buddha pointed out, the reason we suffer is not so much from things happening outside, or even things happening to our bodies. It's from what the mind does to itself, which means that each person has to develop the necessary skills to find true well-being within. So in your own pursuit of the necessary skills, you're actually being responsible. One of the things that the Dalai Lama noted about Westerners that he found very perplexing was that so many people have trouble feeling goodwill for themselves. Partly that's because we've indulged in so much in unskillful pleasures, and partly because of the cultural background we come from, which places a high value on sacrifice for the sake of others. If you're not sacrificing enough, there's something wrong with you. We have to change our attitude. Part of that also goes with an inability not only to have goodwill for yourself, but also finding empathetic joy to be something that's hard. You see other people who are prospering, other people who are happy, and there's a certain amount of resentment. So those are two areas where we really do have to do some work to change our attitude toward happiness. After all, if you resent other people's happiness, you're not going to feel right about your own. And if you can't feel right about your own happiness, it's going to be hard to see other people happy. The two go together, which is why they're part of a set. The Buddha taught 4 Brahma Viharas. He didn't teach just one. Sometimes you hear just nothing but metta, metta, or in some cases, compassion, compassion. But you need all 4: goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. That's one of the reasons why we have that chant at the beginning of every meditation, to remind ourselves that all 4 of these form our motivation. And these are the implications of that motivation: that we want to be above board about our desire for happiness or true well-being, a happiness that lasts, a happiness that doesn't turn on us, a happiness that doesn't cause harm to anybody at all. As for compassion, we have to start out with compassion for ourselves. That doesn't mean indulging every little wish, but it does mean looking for our true well-being, seeing wherever we're causing ourselves suffering, and trying to figure out how we can stop. Then, when it does work, and we can get the mind to settle down and be well, learn how to have some empathetic joy for that. Appreciate that. Remind yourself it's not a selfish thing. We hear the Buddha's teaching on being a loyal friend, where you're happy when your friend is happy, and sad when your friend is sad. But that's not the ideal for a meditator. The ideal for a meditator is not getting tied up in other people's ups and downs. You're there to help them, but you don't take on their sorrows. You can't really take them on anyhow. You can sympathize, and sometimes you can make yourself sorrowful, but that doesn't really help. Sometimes we think, if you don't feel sorry for other people, how are you going to help them? Well, there are other ways of motivating yourself to want to be helpful. And if you want to be genuinely helpful, you need to have some skill. Years back, I remember reading about a woman whose son had been killed in a gang fight. She'd gone to the trial, and, being a good Buddhist, she was spreading lots of compassion, lots of goodwill toward the guy who had knifed her son. But when she came back from the trial, she realized something was still missing. She had a huge amount of resentment for the guy who had introduced her son to the gang to begin with. So she decided to invite the gang members over to the house to sort of sort things out. She found that she felt really sorry for them, but she didn't have anything to offer them. She'd been meditating. She'd learned all about emptiness and all these big Buddhist concepts, but they weren't any use for the suffering of these kids. If you're going to help other people who are suffering, you first have to learn how not to suffer yourself. Now, you don't have to wait until the very end of the path before you're helpful. But it's important that you learn how to treasure your happiness along the way. It's an important part of learning how to look after yourself. We see a society full of so many people who are careless in this area. They just do what they want, and they don't really think about the consequences, which means that the consequences can be pretty bad. They don't know how to look after themselves. It's a kind of irresponsibility. So here, you're being responsible. You're learning how to find well-being inside in a way that's harmless and noble. There's so little nobility in our society right now. People tend to look askance at anything that presents itself as noble, so we feel embarrassed about it. But it's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's an important value, that you learn how to find happiness in a way that's totally harmless, totally blameless. And it's a skill that you can then share with others. You can't make them skillful, but you can give advice. And through your example, you can show other people. This is how it's done. We need more people like this in the world. So learn how to develop all 4 of the Brahma Viharas as a way of adjusting your attitude toward happiness, realizing that it is okay to say, I want to be happy. May I be happy? Years back, I was talking with some nuns from another community. They also had their way of chanting the Brahma Viharas in their chants, both in Pali and in English. I happened to mention that we had our translations as well. Oh, they wanted to hear the translation, so I chanted it, May I be happy. One of the nuns almost fell out of her chair laughing. It was too direct. They had something like, May I abide in well-being, which is not the first thought that occurs to people. The Buddha wanted us to be blunt and straightforward about this. We want to be happy. It's okay. But if you truly want to be happy, it has to be spread around. May other beings be happy too. You want to make sure that your happiness doesn't cause any trouble, any pain, any harm to others. They may not like the way you go for happiness. That kind of pain you can't do anything about. You're not causing them any real harm, and you're certainly not getting them to do anything unskillful. If you see that you're suffering, have compassion for yourself, and then have compassion for others. When you act skillfully, the Buddha recommends that you take joy in that fact, that you're mastering the skill. As for things that you can't change for the time being, develop some equanimity so that you can focus on the areas where you can make a difference. So a large part of the practice is not just in the techniques of the meditation, but it's also in the values lying behind the meditation. And one of the primary values is gaining a proper relationship to the whole idea of happiness and the pursuit of happiness. Realizing that there's something special about the way the Buddha teaches this. It's a noble way to pursue happiness. And that nobility is something really to be cherished. Wise about happiness. When Ajahn Lee analyzes the qualities that you bring into mindfulness practice, and by extension to concentration practice, he singles out ardency as the wisdom factor, which is interesting. It's the factor that has to do with effort, the effort you put into being mindful, into gaining concentration, trying to see into your defilements. Ardency is what does this. And ardency is wisdom in realizing that this is something really worth doing well, and it sets to work at the skill that's involved. That's the kind of discernment the Buddha was talking about. Strategic discernment, discernment in action. After all, as he points out, some kinds of happiness are not noble, others are noble. And among the ignoble forms of happiness, there are gradations. So the question is, which ones are worth pursuing? Which ones are not? After all, happiness just doesn't come floating to you or washing up on shore. It's something you have to bring about. This is very different from the popular notion of Buddhism. There's a book I read recently, A History of Humankind, that devoted a few pages to Buddhism and basically interpreted the Buddhist take on happiness as saying that there are pleasant moments and there are unpleasant moments, and you have to learn to accept that that's the way things are. Everything occurs in just moments. The acceptance gives a certain amount of peace. The image the author gave was sitting on a shore with waves coming in. There are good waves and there are bad waves. You just accept the fact that that's the way the ocean is. It's beyond your control. And wisdom lies in learning to accept the fact that waves will come and then they'll go away. In other words, pleasures and pains are fleeting, so don't get worked up about them. Which is very defeatist and totally missing the point that there are gradations of happiness. Some happiness is long-term, some is short-term. I've often mentioned the question that the Buddha says lies at the basis of wisdom or discernment. What when I do it will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? And I've pointed out that the wisdom there lies in seeing that long-term is better than short-term, and that happiness does depend on your actions. But there's another point as well, in that the Buddha recognizes that there is such a thing as long and short-term to begin with. It's not that everything is just as evanescent as the dew. Some forms of happiness really last for the long term, and they're conducive to gaining the noble happiness that comes from full awakening. Those forms of happiness are really worth pursuing, and they're worth putting a lot of effort into gaining. One of the hallmarks of long-term happiness is that it's harmless as well. As the Buddha points out, if your happiness harms other people, they're not going to stand for it. In fact, realizing that there was such a thing as a harmless happiness was what enabled him to undertake the path, because he saw, as he said, that everybody was struggling for happiness just like fish in a dwindling stream fighting one another for the little bit of water that was there, harming one another in the process, and then dying as the end result, and accomplishing nothing at all but creating a lot of misery for one another. He wondered, is there such a thing as a happiness that doesn't require taking things away from people or being possessive? Is there a happiness that doesn't require conflict? That's what he was looking for. That first answer to that question of, what when I do it will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness, is the practice of merit. As the Buddha said, acts of merit are another word for happiness. Here again, action is the operative word here. It's in doing the generosity, in doing the practice of virtue, and in doing the development of goodwill and other forms of meditation. That's where the happiness lies. And it's not just a happiness for people who don't want to go further on the path. To get further in the path, you have to go through these stages, through these practices. Ajahn Suwat noted when he noticed a lot of Western meditators looking awfully grim on meditation retreat, that it's because they haven't had any good experiences with the Buddhist teachings on generosity and virtue, to give them a sense of well-being, to give them a sense of confidence in his teachings and in themselves, realizing that this is for the sake of happiness and they really can create happiness. What's especially good about the practice of merit is that you see that you can create goodness inside yourself. That's a genuine basis for self-esteem, better than the little gold stars your teacher sticks on your homework paper. Genuine self-esteem comes from realizing that something you've done wasn't all that easy, but you could do it. It's not that we're innately good or we're innately bad, but we have a mixture of things inside us, so it's going to be a struggle. Generosity is not always easy. The precepts are not always easy. Having goodwill for everybody is not easy. So when you can manage it, you've learned a lot of skills and you've developed the sense that, yes, you can create goodness from within you. There's a really solid sense of self-esteem that comes from that. At the same time, of course, the practice of merit prepares you for the Four Noble Truths, because the Four Noble Truths are all about what you do, and the fact that some things you do are more skillful than others. The cause of suffering is something you do. You crave, you cling. The path is something you do. You develop all the factors from right view all the way through to right concentration, to overcome that tendency to crave and to cling. These are all things we're doing, and we want to learn how to do them well, to learn how to abandon the unskillful side of the Four Noble Truths and develop the more skillful side. And you get practice in this area with the practice of merit. The path requires restraint. Well, that's what you learn in the development of virtue and in the development of universal unlimited goodwill. path requires ingenuity, and that too comes from the practice of merit. You find ingenious ways of being generous. Sometimes you don't have much in terms of material wealth, but there are other things you can give. And this is the part of the practice where you can show your creativity. What would you like to give to other people? What goodness you would like to give rise to in the world? There is mindfulness involved remembering a precept, alertness in watching over your actions to make sure that you do follow the precept, and ardency in trying to do it well, realizing that there are times when, in observing the precepts, you might be in danger of telling a truth that someone else would abuse. So how do you learn how not to lie and yet still not divulge that information? That requires ingenuity. That requires discernment. Or how do you figure out how to deal with pests? I lived once with a monk who, when he was a layperson, had been a hunter. He talked about what was like trying to psych out the animals. It was interesting. He seemed to have a lot of sympathy for them. But then, of course, he went ahead and killed them. But if you're taking the precepts, you have to learn to have sympathy for the animals as well. That means not just being nice to them, but figuring out, okay, how we can live together so that they don't get into spaces where you don't want them to go. You've got to think about their psychology, learn to understand them. It's a real lesson in empathy, observing the precepts. And the practice of developing goodwill, as the Buddha said, is a form of mindfulness. It's something you have to determine to do. It doesn't come from your innately good nature. It comes from the potential you have for having goodwill for some beings and learning how to extend it to all beings, which requires mindfulness. You have to keep remembering that in the face of sometimes very bad behavior, how to maintain goodwill in spite of that. And it requires discernment, remembering that happiness does come from actions. This means that when you're extending goodwill to somebody, you're wishing that they would understand the causes for true happiness and be willing and able to act on them. Which, when you understand that, makes it a lot easier to have goodwill for everybody. So the practice of merit prepares you for understanding the Four Noble Truths. When the Buddha explained the Four Noble Truths, often he'd preface them with what he called a graduated discourse, talking first about generosity, and then virtue, and then the rewards of generosity and virtue. Only when he saw you were secure in those ideas would he be willing to talk about the drawbacks of the rewards. Some people go straight to the drawbacks, thinking, well, in that case, I'm not going to bother with generosity or virtue. But that's not how the Buddha meant us to be trained. You've got to train in these things. Taste their rewards so that you're ready for the Four Noble Truths, because you've learned the skills of knowing how to make sacrifices, knowing how to be ingenious, gaining some mindfulness and restraint. That's another aspect of goodwill that we often overlook. Learning the restraint, the patience that's required for goodwill. That too will help with learning to master the Four Noble Truths, because they do carry duties. They're not just truths that sit there on the paper. They're categories of your experience that carry duties. When we're used to the fact that we're here for understanding action, realizing that some actions are more worthwhile than others, because they lead to a happiness that's more worthwhile than others, that's when we're ready for the Four Noble Truths. So there are gradations as to what kind of happiness is worthwhile and what kind of happiness is not. And even though some forms of happiness may not take us all the way to the noble level of the deathless happiness, still some of them are helpful with giving rise to the path. That way, you can give rise to mindfulness And mindfulness then reminds you to give rise to skillful qualities of all kinds. It's not just there watching things coming and going away. When the Buddha talks about mindfulness as a governing principle, it means remembering to give rise to good qualities that are not there yet and to prevent them from falling away, so that the mind can get into concentration and taste a happiness that's on a higher level, more lasting, more solid, which can then form the basis for the rest of the path getting strengthened, so that it can take you all the way to the deathless happiness. So there are gradations of happiness, and it's a skill to understand that and be able to give rise to them, which is why Ajahn Lee said that discernment lies in the ardency first, in wanting to do this well, and then in figuring out how to do it well. Because if you don't do it, it's not going to happen. But if you're wise enough to want to do it, then you're ready for the path.